Buoy 2 had a perfect clock, and it was being condemned anyway, and Yara Haddad sat in the can at the back of third shift and understood finally that the network was not failing. It was being murdered by the thing it kept its time by. 2 was healthy. 2 was 4 years young and nowhere near the dark, and its clock had never drifted a microsecond in its life. And the routing table had just flagged it for desync, because the line a buoy is judged against is not a fixed thing. It is the maker's clock, the deep timing, and the deep timing was slowing. And a slowing reference moves the line under every buoy at once. 2 hadn't moved. The line had moved under it, and it was happening all the way down the chain and down every chain, across the whole frontier, all at the same time. She had told them this was coming. She had been telling them for 4 years, in reports nobody read until an oversight officer named Solheim built them into a file with a number. She had proven the drift to that officer with her own hands, against the officer's own certified clock, and the officer had believed her, and the inquiry had gone up the chain, and now the chain had finally understood. And the chain's answer was not what Yara had hoped. The reach was withdrawing. The logic was airtight, and it made her sick. The frontier's whole infrastructure was timed to a clock the makers had left running, and nobody could fix. The clock was slowing. The infrastructure would fail. You could not maintain a network against a reference that was sliding out from under it. You would spend lives and fortunes retiming buoys that would only desync again next month, faster. So the authority, reading the inquiry it had funded, made the sane institutional choice. Stop throwing good crews after a dying clock. Decertify the frontier arcs. Pull the contractors back. Abandon the edge. Abandon the edge meant Corward Station and the stationborn living inside their changing hull. It meant the Vask routes that threaded the dead zone margins. It meant rest, somewhere out on a thin lane, kin adjacent and a hand that answered when called. It meant every human and ally who lived where the clock was loudest, left to fall off a moving line with no one tending the buoys. Yara had spent 4 years being the person out here who answered when the Accord wouldn't. She was not going to become the Accord. She sat with the dying chain a while, because it deserved that. She knew every buoy on it by its wear. 4's old cough. 5 that she'd been into a metronome twice and saved twice. The ghost socket where 8 used to be before she overdrove it to death to count a stranger out of the dark. They were not hers on any register the Reach kept. They were inherited tech, salvage supplied, a journeyman's posting. But she had spent 4 years out here talking to them to fill the silence. And the Reach was about to switch them all off and call it prudence, and let the dark have the edge of the map because the dark had a clock the Reach couldn't fix. She thought about Corward, the stationborn keeping their warm hull alive by retiming to its new beat instead of fleeing it. She thought about Ress, kin adjacent, out on a thin lane, a hand that answered when called. She thought about every promise the frontier had ever made by simply being tended and what it meant to walk away from all of it, because the thing at the center had started to change. And she made the decision she had been circling for 4 years, since the night she first marked the center of the avoidance curve on her chart beside the words, "No relay." She was going to go look at it, not because anyone had asked her to, because she was the only person alive who had charted it 3 different ways and kept its time by hand. And if anyone was going to stand at the edge of the oldest silence in the galaxy and find out whether it was dying or waking, it was going to be the woman who had spent 4 years learning its name by its wear. The survey craft came for her a week later, and the oversight officer was aboard it, which Yara had not expected.
I signed the withdrawal order.
Renata Solheim said before Yara could even get a word out.
It was the correct order on the evidence I had. Then I read your last report, the one where you said the center could be approached without being entered, and I realized I had signed away the frontier on the assumption that nothing could be done, when the one person who has been right about all of this the entire time says something can. So I am here, off the record, with a survey craft and a window before the order finalizes, to find out if you can do the thing you said.
You came all the way out here to ask me that in person?
I came to measure it myself. I do not buy pitches, Haddad. I buy what I can put a certified instrument against. Show me you can get an ear to the center, and I will burn whatever's left of my career holding the withdrawal order open. Fail, and I have at least come to the edge in person to watch it close, which is more than my office usually manages.
They flew toward the hush together, the contractor and the bureaucrat, and on the long burnout, Yara explained the things she could not do and the things she could, and learned how much the rest of the frontier had quietly been moving toward the same dark. Because she was not alone in it anymore, and that was the strangest part. The xenolinguist on the inquiry, Anand, had built a thing out of 5 frontier reports that proved the silences were all changing at once. The tech at the gas giant station, Cade, had gotten the deep ones to answer the slowing clock in chorus across 100 worlds. A fired Combine lead was carrying a complete map of every silence on the chart, and somewhere a salvage chief she'd never met had been pointed at this exact center by an alien who had spent 2 years aiming him. For 4 years, Yara had been the only person who could hear the Maker's clock and the loneliest woman on the frontier for it. Now there was a whole quiet network of people who could not unhear it either, all of them drifting toward the same dark from different directions, and she was the one who had been closest the longest.
I want to understand the rule you are about to break.
Renata said, somewhere on the second day of the burn, slate in her lap, because she did not know how to be anywhere without taking notes.
Precisely. Not the spirit of it, the letter. If I am going to hold an order open on the strength of it, I need to be able to say, on the record, that you did not cross a boundary the accord forbids crossing.
The rule is you don't go into a kept place.
Yara said.
That's the whole rule, and it's a good one, because the people who broke it aren't around to argue. Nothing comes back. Not matter, not signal, not a Vask runner who got too brave. So I'm not going in.
You are laying instruments toward it.
Toward, not in. There's a line, and the line is real, and I've spent 4 years charting exactly where it is, which is more than the people who wrote the rule ever did. I can put an ear right up against the door. I just can't open it. Nobody opens it. That's the one thing everybody who's ever met one of these places agrees on.
Renata wrote it down. The exact words, the way she wrote down everything that might have to be defended later.
You frontier people speak about a thing that has killed everyone who touched it, as though it were a difficult neighbor.
It is a difficult neighbor,
Yara said.
It's been on this lane longer than we've been a species. You learn to live next to a thing, or you leave. The Reach wants to leave. I want to learn its name. Everybody who's ever really heard this thing ends up doing the same dumb, beautiful thing.
She told Renata, watching the dark grow in the viewport.
They stop asking it what it is, and they play it its own voice back, like saying a stranger's name in the dark. We're the only species in the galaxy stupid enough to keep knocking on a door that eats everything that goes through it. I'm about to do it from closer than anyone ever has.
You could not fly into a kept place and come back. That was the oldest rule on the frontier, older than the charts, and the underworld and the Vask and the dead all agreed on it. Matter and signal that crossed the boundary did not return. So she was not going to cross it. She was going to do what Soren Cade had done with the U, and what she had done with Res, and what humanity, it turned out, was the only species reckless enough to keep doing. She was going to reach the center without touching it, by echo, not by entry. It took her the better part of a week, and it was the hardest thing she had ever built. She had spent her career learning that you could retime a healthy buoy into exact phase with the deep timing and turn it into a repeater, a metronome of the maker's own clock, loud enough for a deafened neighbor to reacquire. The trick had saved 2 buoys in 2 years. Now she ran it to its absolute limit. Not one repeater, but a chain of them, hand-laid one at a time deeper and deeper toward the center, each one phase-locked to the slowing clock, each one passing the reference a little further in than any buoy had ever been placed. A relay built not to carry voices, but to carry the maker's time itself, threaded toward the heart of the silence on the silence's own beat. Close enough at the end of it to set one listening instrument at the very threshold of the center without ever crossing the line that kept what entered. She built it the way she had built everything in her life, one piece at a time, by hand, with no one to check it. The survey craft would creep forward a few thousand kilometers and hold, and she would prep a buoy on the rack, strip its housekeeping layer, retime its clock into exact phase with the slowing reference, test the lock until the telltale held steady, and then she would put it out the lock and nudge it into place and wait, sometimes an hour, watching to see whether it would hold its phase or whether the deep timing had already slid far enough to break the lock she had just set. Then she would move the craft up and do it again. A buoy a watch, then a buoy every 2 watches, then slower, because the closer she got, the longer each one took to settle and the harder the dark dragged at it. She stopped sleeping properly somewhere around the 9th buoy. She ate standing at the boards. She talked to the chain the way she talked to the 9 chain at home. Low and constant, naming each new buoy as she said it, because a thing with a name was a thing you would fight harder to keep. The pull got worse the deeper she laid the chain. The hush did not just sit there being absent. It wanted the way a drain wants, patient and enormous, and every buoy she placed closer to the center took longer to settle and dragged harder at the craft. Twice she nearly lost a buoy across the boundary and had to let it go dead in her hands rather than chase it in. She logged the claws she was breaking each time, touching the housekeeping layer, overdriving a phase lock past spec, next to the time, the way she always had, so that whoever read her log would know she had understood exactly which rule she broke and exactly why. It was the most reach thing a person could do, and she did it 40,000 kilometers from anyone, at the edge of a dark that had swallowed ships since before the Accord drew the charts. The worst of it came at the 17th buoy. She set it, and it would not settle. It drifted, slow and wrong, not back toward her, but inward, toward the center, the phase lock she had built turning into a leash the dark was pulling on. For a few seconds she fought it on the manual thruster feed, hands flat on the board, trying to walk a dead buoy back from a boundary that had never once given anything back. Then she made herself do the hardest thing a tender ever does, which is let go. She cut it loose and watched it fall away into the absolute dark. A healthy buoy she had retimed with her own hands, gone the way 8 had gone. And she logged it, 1 line, the claws and the time, and she did not chase it. She set the 18th a little further back from the edge, because the dark had just told her exactly how close was too close, and she had learned a long time ago to listen when the frontier taught you something in the only language it had. The last buoy she would not trust to a winch. She suited up and went out on a tether to set it by hand, because the placement had to be exact, and because some part of her needed to be the one who carried the maker's time to the very edge of the dark herself. Out there, off the craft, the pull was a physical thing. It was not wind, and it was not gravity, and it was nothing her training had a word for. It was the simple, patient certainty of a place that took everything, reaching for her the way it reached for the buoys, and the only thing between her and being kept was a frayed tether and her own refusal. She set the ear at the threshold with her scarred hands shaking inside the gauntlets. She got the phase lock to hold, and then she did the thing the whole frontier was built on, and the rules were written for, and her entire life had been practiced for. She stopped at the line with the answer to the oldest question in the galaxy 1 meter past her fingertips, and she did not cross. She climbed back along the tether hand over hand, into the craft, to the boards, put the headphones on, and listened to the closest recording of the maker's clock anyone had ever made. She had heard the deep timing from 1,000 light years away as a single slow regular pulse. She had heard it skip once, in a 5-hour recording, and stutter the whole chain. She had heard it slow across months between 2 readers that both died of the hearing. She thought she knew the maker's clock. At the threshold, it was not 1 pulse. It was many. Close enough, the single beat she had charted her whole career resolved into a crowd of beats, dozens, hundreds, that had been so nearly in unison from far away that they read as one, and they were no longer in unison. They were drifting apart from each other, each one falling at its own slightly different rate, the way a single thing coming apart sounds, or the way a single thing waking sounds, before it has coordinated itself, before all its parts remember they are one thing. She could not tell which. She would never be able to tell which. That was the whole horror and the whole hope of it in the same sound. The maker's clock, at closest range, was either dying into 100 failing pieces or waking into 100 parts that had not yet found each other. And then she did the thing she had come to do, the thing the rules permitted and her whole life had been rehearsal for. She played it back. She took the maker's own slowing time, the crowd of drifting beats, and she fed it through the threshold relay and sent it home to the center. Not a question, not a probe, not a demand. An echo. The center's own falling clock played gently back at the center, the way she had once telegraphed a Vask runner out of this same dark, the way a young xenoacoustics tech had once echoed the deep ones their own voice. I heard you. That was all. That was the whole sentence. At the threshold of the oldest silence in the galaxy. The center answered. For one beat, one single beat, in the closest recording any human had ever made, the crowd of drifting pulses at the center pulled together and matched her. Matched the rhythm she had sent, held it for a breath, the way a person turns toward a voice that has said their name, and then it let go, and resumed its slow falling apart. Dozens of beats sliding away from each other into the dark, as if the effort of coordinating, of being one thing again, was more than it could hold. The maker's clock could hear. The maker's clock had heard her, and it could not, or would not, or was no longer able to, keep itself together long enough to say anything more than, "Yes, I am here. I heard you too." Renata Solheim had been watching the certified instrument the whole time, the way she watched everything, refusing to believe anything she had not measured herself. When the center matched the echo, the officer did not say anything for a long moment. Then she took off her reading glasses, which Yara had learned was how she said she had seen a true thing.
I measured it against my own clock. It matched you. For one beat, the oldest object in the galaxy did what you told it to do, and then it couldn't hold it.
She was quiet.
The withdrawal order is dead. I am not going to be the officer who pulled humanity off the frontier in the year the frontier learned to talk back to the thing at the center of it, whatever this costs me.
She had what she came for. The recording would stop the withdrawal. The frontier would not be abandoned. The stationborn and the Vask routes in the edge would be tended a while longer. It was a partial victory, which was the only kind the frontier ever gave. She had reached the threshold and not the thing. She had heard the clock and not understood it. She had been answered and could not read the answer. But she sat at the boards a while longer after Renata went to draft the order that would unabandon the edge. And she did the thing she had not put in the report and would not. She played the maker's own slowing time back to the center one last time, and she waited, the way she had once waited for a Vask runner to send back a count, the way a tech 1,000 light years away waited for the deep ones, the way her whole species had apparently decided to spend its short, loud life, knocking and waiting to see if anyone was home. The center matched her. Then it didn't. Then there was only the slow fall, the crowd of drifting beats sliding apart in the dark, and Yara Haddad alone at the edge of it, the closest any human had ever been to the oldest question in the galaxy, with no more answer than when she started. Only nearer.